I worked the night shift at an isolated gas station north of Hermosillo, where the highway seems to vanish into infinity. My nights are long and lonely, lit only by the weak fluorescent lights of the station and the occasional headlights of a passing vehicle. I never thought this job could affect me, but now I'm not so sure. It all began a few weeks ago. On an ordinary early morning, an old sedan pulled up to one of the pumps. The driver was a thin man with messy hair and a patchy beard. There was nothing remarkable about him except his behavior. He pumped exactly 300 pesos worth of gas, paid in cash without saying a word, and drove off. I thought nothing of it till he showed up again the next night at the same time with the exact same amount. It wasn't until the third time that I realized even his clothes were the same. A wrinkled white t-shirt and worn-out jeans. It unsettled me, but I limited myself to doing my job. The night routine doesn't leave much room to question others. However, something even stranger began to happen. Most of our customers were truck drivers, people traveling long distances. One of them, a burly man with tattoos on his arms, always greeted me with a "good evening, kid," but that night he said nothing. His face was pale and his movements clumsy, as if he were dizzy. He bought a soda and a bag of chips, but when he left, he dropped the bottle on the ground and didn't bother to pick it up. As the nights went on, I began to notice patterns among the customers. Some repeated themselves far too often, always appearing at the same time and buying the same things. A woman in an old Beetle with a dented bumper came every 2 days, always at 3:17 a.m., asking for a black coffee, even though it was hot. Another customer, a man with a pickup truck, filled his tank to the exact same number of liters every time, 45.7. No more, no less. One night around 2 a.m., I decided to step out of the office and look at the road. The air was cool and the silence overwhelming. As I watched the asphalt ribbon disappear into the horizon, a noise behind me made me turn around. It was the man from the sedan, standing next to the pump. But this time, he wasn't filling his tank. He was just standing there, watching me. His gaze was so piercing that it left me frozen. When I finally reacted and blinked, he was already inside the car, driving away without turning on the headlights. The event that pushed me past my limit happened a week later. I was cleaning the counter when I noticed the man with the pickup outside, standing next to his vehicle. He wasn't doing anything, just staring at the office building. I turned on the exterior lights so he'd know I saw him, but he didn't move. When I went out to ask if he needed help, I noticed something about his face. It showed no expression at all, no fear, no anger, no joy. It was as if he were an empty shell. He got into the truck and drove off before I could say anything. But when I went back inside, I felt an inexplicable chill. I checked the security cameras, and to my surprise, there was no trace of his truck in the footage. It was as if he had never been there. That same night, I reviewed the customer logs. That's when I realized that the payment records for several of them were duplicated, always the same dates and amounts, as if they were repeating in an endless cycle. I decided to talk to my supervisor the next day. He told me not to worry, that night shifts were lonely and could play tricks on the mind. But I noticed how he avoided eye contact when I mentioned the man in the sedan. "Sometimes it's better not to ask questions," he said. Since then, I can't stop thinking about what happens here every night while the same faces appear and repeat their actions. I feel like I'm trapped in some kind of inexplicable loop. I've considered quitting, but something holds me back, a mix of fear and fascination that I can't explain. The early mornings are no longer just long. They're heavy, loaded with something I can't quite understand. And as I keep working, waiting for dawn, I can't help but wonder what will become of me if one day I turn into one of them.
Getting a job as a security guard in Mexico City isn't hard if you're willing to accept strange conditions. When I was offered a night shift at an abandoned hospital downtown, I thought it was exactly the kind of easy gig I needed. No fights, just walking through empty hallways and reporting if someone tried to sneak in. Plus, the pay was good. The hospital was a huge gray building with broken windows and graffiti covering the exterior walls. It had been closed for over 20 years. Even so, the security company insisted the place still needed to be watched because it was technically still government property. "Watch out for looters or homeless people," they told me. But when I arrived for my first shift, something about the atmosphere made me think it wasn't as empty as they claimed. The first floor was practically in ruins. Rusted medical equipment lay scattered across the ground, and the air smelled of dampness and metal. Exposed cables hung from the walls, and ceiling panels had collapsed. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought. But when I went up to the second floor, I noticed something strange. The lights were on. Not all of them, just a few in the main hallway, flickering every now and then. I asked Manuel, the guard finishing his shift. He was an older man with the tired face of someone who had spent too many years doing this kind of work. "Are those lights always on?" I asked. Manuel looked at me as if I had told him a joke. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's better not to ask why," he said as he picked up his lunch bag. Then he added, "And avoid the 5th floor. Nothing good happens up there." His warning seemed strange, but I didn't push it. Nobody wants to look scared on their first day. For the first few hours, the hospital behaved like any other empty building. My boots echoed through the deserted hallways, and the only thing keeping me awake was the instant coffee I'd brought. But around 2 a.m., while making my rounds on the 3rd floor, I heard a noise, a rattling sound, like someone moving something metallic. I froze and listened carefully. The sound came from the end of the hallway, from a room that, according to the map, it was supposed to be empty. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a little ridiculous. No answer. I decided to get closer. When I peeked through the half-open door, my flashlight illuminated something that made me step back. An old wheelchair, one of its wheels slowly spinning, as if someone had just moved it. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, though there were no open windows in that room. I put the wheelchair back in place and closed the door. The rest of the night passed relatively calmly, but when my shift ended, I couldn't get the image of that chair out of my head. The next day I mentioned it to Manuel, but he just laughed. "It's normal. Those things happen here. But like I told you, don't go to the 5th floor." My curiosity grew. Why so much mystery about the 5th floor? That night, after making sure everything was quiet on the other levels, I took the elevator up. When the doors opened, an intense cold wrapped around me, far colder than on the other floors. The air smelled strange, like chemicals mixed with old blood.
The hallway was in better condition than I expected, with nearly intact white walls and closed doors, each with small windows near the top. Everything looked far too clean for an abandoned hospital. I walked slowly, checking the doors one by one. Most had faded numbers and labels: Operating Room 5, Intensive Care Unit. But at the end of the hallway, I found a different door. It had no window, no label, just a large rusted lock. I pressed my ear against it and heard something, a low, constant hum, as if machinery were still running behind it. I decided not to investigate further that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Things started getting strange after that visit to the 5th floor. During my rounds on the following nights, I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. The lights flickered more often, and one night, while checking the 4th floor, I saw something that froze my blood. A figure in a white hospital gown crossing the far end of the hallway. I ran after it, shouting, "Hey, you can't be here!" But when I reached the end, the hallway was empty. The only nearby door led to a room filled with rusted beds and dusty medical equipment. I checked every corner, but found no one. The last night I worked there was the worst. I was on the 3rd floor when I heard the sound of an elevator. I thought it was another guard, but when I looked at the control panel, I saw the elevator was going to the 5th floor. It made no sense for anyone to be there. I decided to follow it. I took the stairs, and when I arrived, the elevator doors were open. Inside, an empty gurney stood in the center, its wheels squeaking softly as it shifted slightly. Before I could react, I heard a loud bang behind me. The unlabeled door was open. I don't know what compelled me to go inside, but I did. The room was small and filled with medical equipment that looked brand new. In the center was a metal table, and on it lay what appeared to be a medical file, with my name on it. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. The first page showed my photo and details about my medical history, things no one should have known. A sound behind me made me turn around. The door slammed shut, and the lights began to flicker. That's when I saw it, a tall, thin human figure wearing a doctor's coat. It had no face, just a smooth white surface where its features should have been. It moved towards me slowly, and the last thing I remember was a sharp pain in my chest before I passed out. When I woke up, I was in my bed. My uniform was clean, with no trace of what had happened. I tried to contact the security company, but they told me they no longer worked at that hospital. They said it was permanently closed weeks ago. I never went back to the building, but sometimes in my dreams I hear the sound of those squeaking wheels and the low hum of the 5th floor, and I know, somehow, I never truly left that hospital.
I'm a night delivery driver. Not glamorous, I know, but someone has to bring tacos to the hungry people who crave them at 3 a.m. I drive an old Pointer that shakes like it's made of gelatin every time I hit a speed bump, and my app notifies me of orders with a monotonous sound that I'm already sick of. The night is usually quiet, although sometimes the streets feel like a world apart, lonely and strange. It all started on an ordinary night, on a bland Monday. The notification came in while I was parked in front of an OXXO in Iztapalapa, drinking a coffee to stay awake. The address said Callejón de los Olmos, 345, Colonia El Arenal. I didn't recognize it, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the strangest neighborhoods have the best customers. I picked up the order, a hamburger with fries, and headed toward the location. The alley was narrow, barely lit by a flickering street lamp. The houses were old, some with windows covered in cardboard. I got out of the car and walked to the indicated door, 345. I rang the bell and waited. Time dragged on, and I began to feel watched, even though there was no one in sight. Finally, someone spoke from the other side of the door. "Leave it there, please." The voice was male, but faint, almost as if he were afraid of being heard. I left the package on a small stool and went back to the car. When I confirmed the delivery in the app, I noticed something strange. There was no record of the order, no name, no history. I decided to ignore it and continue my shift. But the strange deliveries began to repeat. One night, I had to deliver to an address in Tlalpan. The GPS led me to an empty lot, fenced off with metal sheets. I tried calling the customer's number, but no one answered. As I hesitated, wondering whether to leave, I received a message in the app. "Leave it on the ground next to the entrance." There was no entrance, but next to the gate there was a gap between the sheets, like an opening. I left the bag there, and when I returned to the car, I noticed the order was already marked as delivered. The strangest thing of all was that when I checked my tips, there was always a generous amount of money deposited in my account. Even though that should have made me happy, it only made me feel more uneasy. The worst night was a few weeks ago. It had been raining for hours, and the streets looked like rivers. I received an order for an address in Colonia Doctores, near an old abandoned hospital. When I arrived, the place was plunged into darkness that my headlights barely pierced. The GPS indicated the address was at the end of a dead-end alley. I hesitated, but the need to do my job pushed me forward. I got out of the car, water dripping from my jacket, and walked toward the indicated door. It was an old, rusty gate, closed with chains and padlocks. Before I could touch it, I felt something moved behind me. "Leave it there, young man." The voice came from behind me. I turned and saw a tall, thin man wearing a hat and a soaked overcoat. I didn't dare look him in the eyes, but I felt his presence, heavy, almost oppressive. I obeyed and left the package on the ground without saying a word. When I got back into the car, I started the engine with trembling hands. When I checked the app, the order was already closed, and the tip was 1,000 pesos. My breathing was heavy, and I decided it would be my last delivery of the night. Eventually, I talked to a co-worker, another delivery driver who knew the area well. When I mentioned the addresses, his face changed. "Those houses don't exist anymore, man," he said, in a tone that made my skin crawl. "The one in Los Olmos burned down 10 years ago. The one in Tlalpan has been an empty lot ever since the factory closed. And the one in Doctores? No, man, that place is cursed." That night, I decided to uninstall the app. I quit the job, and now I do deliveries during the day, under the sun, where the world still seems normal. But every now and then, I receive a strange message in my email. "Thanks for your delivery, always on time." I never reply, and I never plan to return to those streets. I have been a taxi driver in Mexico City for more than 10 years. I know the streets like the lines of my own hands, the same hands that hold the steering wheel during endless shifts. I mainly work at night, not because I enjoy it, but because that's when you earn more. People go out to parties, bars, gatherings. There's always someone who needs a taxi at those hours. But lately, the nights have changed. There's something strange in the air, something I can't explain. It all started 3 months ago. I picked up a young woman in Roma, one of those neighborhoods that are always full of life, even late at night. She was young, maybe in her 20s, and she was wearing a dark coat that barely protected her from the cold. She asked me to take her to Tlalpan, a long ride, but one that promised good pay. During the trip, she barely spoke. She just stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness. I asked her if she wanted to listen to music, but she shook her head slightly. I focused on driving, trying to avoid potholes and endless traffic lights. When we reached the address she gave me, a poorly lit street surrounded by trees, I turned around to tell her we had arrived, but she wasn't there. The back seat was empty. I thought maybe she had gotten out at a stoplight. It seemed strange, but not impossible, as if she had done it on purpose. I took her coat with me the next day, thinking she might call to get it back, but no one ever did. In the end, I left it at the taxi base in case she showed up. After that incident, I started noticing patterns. Passengers would get in, stay silent during the ride, and disappear before paying. First it was the young woman, then an older man I picked up near Bellas Artes. His destination was a house in Iztapalapa. During the ride, he only mentioned that he was going to reunite with someone. When I arrived, I once again found an empty seat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'm losing my mind, I thought, or maybe they were robbing me, though it made no sense. Money was never missing, and nothing in the car was gone. But after several nights like that, I began to feel afraid. One Thursday, a woman got into my taxi near the Merced. She was wearing a white dress, far too light for the cold night. She wanted to go to a hospital in Coyoacan. During the ride, I noticed her hands were shaking, and I offered her a bottle of water that I always carry with me. She accepted it with a shy smile, but when we arrived at the hospital, the bottle was still on the back seat, along with her absence. That's when I realized something. Every time they disappeared, they left something behind, a coat, a bottle, a scarf, as if they wanted me to remember that they had been there. I decided to investigate. I checked taxi databases to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. I found nothing relevant. But when I mentioned my situation to a coworker, he looked at me seriously. "Maybe you're being followed by those who are no longer here," he said, with a tone that mixed mockery and warning. Although I tried to laugh it off, his comment stayed with me. A week ago, I picked up a young man on Insurgentes Sur, near the Teatro de los Insurgentes. He got into the car in a hurry, as if he were running away from something. He was wearing a sports jacket and carrying a backpack. He asked me to take him to a neighborhood in Xochimilco.
During the ride, he kept looking out the window as if he expected someone to be following him. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to break the ice. He just nodded without looking at me. When we arrived at the address, an old house with peeling paint, I turned around to tell him the fare. He wasn't there. But this time was different. This time I found a piece of paper on the back seat, a note written in hurried letters. "Thanks for the ride. I needed to arrive. You will arrive soon, too." Since then, I no longer drive at night.
I have worked as a cleaning staff member in a corporate building in Santa Fe, Mexico City for 3 years. My routine has always been the same. Starting the night shift, collecting trash from the offices, vacuuming carpets, cleaning windows, and disinfecting bathrooms. I have always preferred the solitude of the night. The silence helps me concentrate, and honestly, it saves me from the unpleasant moments of dealing with rushed employees. The building, an elegant skyscraper with tinted glass, is a labyrinth of offices and conference rooms. At night, it becomes something completely different, an almost living place with the constant hum of the air conditioning, the flickering lights of monitors in sleep mode, and shadows that seem to move when you're not looking. Everything began a few weeks ago when I was assigned to the 23rd floor, the VIP area, as the rest of the cleaning crew calls it. That's where the company's top executives have their offices. It's rare for us to work there, since they prefer to clean it during the day with a special team. But that night, something in their schedule changed, and I was the one sent to clean it. I entered with my cart and began as usual. Everything was spotless, as if no one ever used those offices. That gave me a bad feeling from the start. When I reached the conference room, I noticed that one of the glass doors was slightly ajar. I didn't give it much importance and continued cleaning. That was when I saw something strange, a forgotten folder on the polished wooden table. My first instinct was not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. The folder had no label or name, but it was full of documents. As I skimmed through them, my hands began to sweat. I didn't understand everything, but there were enough key words to realize they were fraudulent contracts, money transfers to tax havens, and the names of politicians. My hands were shaking. I decided to keep it and finish cleaning as if nothing had happened. The following days, I couldn't get the folder out of my head. I took it home and hid it in a shoebox. Every night when I returned to the 23rd floor, I felt like someone was watching me. Once I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. Another night, while cleaning the windows of an office, I saw my reflection, and for a second I swore there was a shadow behind me. The worst came later. One night, while emptying the trash bins in an office, I noticed something strange. Inside a drawer, there was a small key taped to the bottom. I took it, and after hesitating for a few seconds, I decided to try my luck.
I knew there was a locked cabinet in the conference room. Curiosity got the better of me once again. The key fit perfectly. When I opened it, I found a laptop and a black folder. I turned on the computer, and to my surprise, it had no password. There were files with clear labels, witnesses, projects, payments. I opened one titled Secured. There were photos of people, addresses, and brief descriptions. They were company employees who had disappeared, some administrative staff, others minor executives. Panic overwhelmed me. Was this a list of victims? My breathing quickened. I closed the laptop and put everything back in its place, but I knew I had crossed a line I could never come back from. From that night on, things became more sinister. Someone started leaving notes on my cleaning cart. The first one said, "We know what you did." I thought it was a joke, but then more came. "Be careful what you find. Someone is always watching." My paranoia grew. I felt like the security cameras were turning toward me, and I even began to notice that some night guards were watching me more than usual. One Tuesday, when I got home, I found my door slightly open. I entered carefully, my heart pounding out of my chest. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I checked the shoebox where I had hidden the documents, I discovered that the folder was gone. In its place was a photo of me, taken at some point inside the building while I was pushing my cart. I knew I had to get out of there, but fear of the consequences paralyzed me. Finally, one night I was called into the night manager's office. I thought it would be about my work, but what happened there changed me forever. The manager wasn't alone. There were two men in suits, their faces serious and their hands firmly folded on the table. "We know you found something you shouldn't have seen," one of them said, his voice as cold as the air conditioning. I tried to deny everything, but they pulled out the folder and opened it in front of me, spreading the documents across the table. The other man leaned toward me, his eyes dark like wells. "This is not a game. You are a witness, and witnesses tend to disappear. But we are generous. If you cooperate and forget all of this, you can continue working here without problems." I felt my world collapse. I assured them I would comply, and they let me go, but the threat was clear. I quit the next day. I left Mexico City and now work in a small hotel in a remote town. I never heard from them again, but I live with the constant feeling that someone is following me. Every time I see a shadow or hear a noise at night, I think of that folder, of the documents I should never have seen, and of the secrets I was never meant to discover. In this world, there are truths that are better left unknown.
My name is Gabriel, and I am a baker in a quiet neighborhood of Guadalajara. My bakery, La Buena Masa, has been my life for the past 10 years. Every dawn, while the rest of the neighborhood sleeps, I light the ovens and begin preparing the conchas, bolillos, and croissants that fill the streets with their aroma. It all began a few weeks ago. It was an ordinary early morning, and the wood-fired oven my grandfather left me was glowing with its usual warm light. I had sat down for a few minutes on the small bench in front of the oven while waiting for the first batch of bolillos to be ready. That was when I noticed it for the first time. As I opened the heavy oven door, a dark shadow seemed to slip between the flames, quick and elusive, as if it were escaping my gaze. I shook my head, thinking it was just the effect of my exhaustion. After all, I had been sleeping very little because we were in the busy season for the patron saint festivities. I decided to ignore it and continue working. But as the days went by, I began to feel something strange, as if the oven had a life of its own. The situation grew more unsettling one night when I stayed alone longer than usual. I had prepared a special batch of pineapple empanadas, and while placing the trays inside the oven, I felt a gust of cold air that seemed to come from inside it. That was impossible. The oven was over 200 degrees. I instinctively stepped back and slammed the door shut. I could swear that at that moment I heard a low murmur, like a barely audible whisper. In the days that followed, the shadows became more obvious. I could see them moving inside the oven while I worked. Sometimes they looked like human figures, other times shapeless forms sliding through the flames. At first, I thought they were reflections, the play of light and shadow produced by the embers, but there was something about their movement that didn't feel natural. One night, while waiting for some croissants to finish baking, I gathered my courage and stared directly into the flames. The shadows moved with a strange cadence, as if they were dancing to a fire that did not obey normal laws. Suddenly, one of the figures seemed to raise an arm, pointing directly at me. I jumped back, tripping over a sack of flour and falling to the floor. The oven, as if mocking me, let out a deep creak. I could no longer ignore it. I spoke to Don Ernesto, a regular customer and neighborhood resident who also has a reputation for being a wise man. I told him what was happening, hoping he would give me a logical explanation. He grew thoughtful for a moment and then said, "That oven is old. It may have kept more stories than you imagine." His comment didn't help, but it also didn't make me feel like I was crazy. That same night, when I finished the last bolillo, I turned off the lights and stood in front of the oven, armed with a flashlight. I wanted to understand what was happening. I opened the oven door slowly and shone the light inside. What I saw left me frozen. The shadows were there, motionless, as if they knew I was watching them. One of them slid toward me, stopping right at the edge of the door. And then I saw it. It had something like a face, a vague, blurry face that seemed to smile at me from inside. I slammed the door shut and staggered back, trembling. From that moment on, every time I lit the oven, the shadows seemed bolder, more real. They left marks on the trays, strange shapes that didn't match the form of the bread. One day, an empanada came out with a pattern that looked like an eye staring straight at me. Fed up with fear, I decided the only solution was to get rid of the oven. But when I turned it off for the last time, the shadows didn't disappear. On the contrary, that night I felt something following me home. I heard sounds behind me, light footsteps, even though there was no one there. When I arrived, I locked the door and turned off the lights, but the fear stayed with me. The next morning, La Buena Masa was closed. I left a sign that said, "Closed for repairs." No one else ever saw the shadows, but I have never forgotten them. Perhaps they are still there, waiting, hidden in some corner of that old oven, and I wonder, when someone lights it again, what they will find among the flames.
My name is Carlos Guzman. I am a maintenance technician in a power plant south of Monterrey. I've been in this line of work for 10 years, with shifts that sometimes feel endless, surrounded by noisy engines, worn cables, and the persistent smell of burnt oil. I've always believed that every problem has a logical solution. Electricity is not capricious, it simply obeys its own laws. But what happened a few weeks ago challenged everything I thought I knew. And every night since then, I ask myself whether it was real or just a delusion brought on by exhaustion. That night, I was on the night shift. The crew was small. Only Manuel, the control room operator, Raul, my colleague in the maintenance area, and me. Everything was going according to routine. The plant had been running at full capacity all day, handling the peak summer demand. At 10:15 p.m., Manuel radioed us to say the system was registering frequency oscillations. Probably the regulator, I thought. It's a common failure when temperatures rise. Raul and I went down to the engine room, a narrow space full of pipes and the constant hum of the generators. However, all the mechanical indicators looked normal. We checked connections, opened panels, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Even so, the frequency remained unstable. At 11:30 p.m., the first blackout occurred. It was abrupt, a hard blow, a void that plunged the entire plant into absolute darkness. In a place like this, losing power isn't just an inconvenience, it's dangerous. After a few seconds of confusion, the emergency lighting activated, bathing the area in a red tone that made every shadow seem deeper. Raul and I split up to check the main transformers. I walked toward the substation, an isolated structure at the end of a long, poorly ventilated corridor. The air was thick, the heat unbearable. As I walked, something caught my attention, a slight flicker in the emergency lights. It was almost imperceptible, but constant, as if something were interfering with the power supply. When I reached the substation, the scene was confusing. No fuse was blown, and the circuit breakers hadn't tripped. That's when I noticed something strange on the floor, right in front of one of the transformers. There were marks, footprints, but they weren't normal. They were elongated, disproportionate, as if someone barefoot with deformed feet had walked there. I crouched down to inspect them more closely, but they were dry, with no trace of mud or water to explain their origin. "Raul," I said over the radio, trying to sound calm, "has anyone else been down here?" "No, just you," he replied, his voice more tense than usual. I went back to the control room, where Manuel was checking the monitors. The first thing he told me was that the security cameras had stopped recording just before the blackout. That's not normal, he assured me, and he was right. The cameras are connected to an independent system, impossible to shut down without physical access to the server. When the system finally came back online, something even more worrying happened. One of the turbines started up by itself. That was impossible. It required manual activation. Raoul and I ran to shut it down. We found it operating at full capacity, but strangely, none of the fuel valves were open. The turbine was running with no visible energy source feeding it. After disconnecting it, the tension in the equipment and between us was palpable. We decided to review the system's historical data in the control room. While Manuel loaded the information, I noticed the logs showed anomalous consumption spikes at hours when the plant should have been stable. It was as if something had been drawing energy directly from the core of the system. Raoul, growing increasingly uneasy, suggested we check the generators on the perimeter of the plant. I followed him, though each step felt heavier than the last. When we reached the perimeter, under the red emergency light, we saw something that still keeps me awake at night. One of the main valves was open, dripping a dark, thick liquid. The strange thing wasn't the leak itself, but the fact that someone had to have turned that valve manually. "This makes no sense," Raoul said, barely above a whisper. That's when we heard the noise, a sharp udar, like metal striking metal, coming from the ventilation tunnel behind us. I turned immediately, flashlight in hand, but the tunnel was empty, or at least that's what I thought, because when I shone the light, I swear I saw a shadow move, fast and agile, disappearing into the darkness. We returned to the control room without saying much. Each of us checked the systems, searching for a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Manuel was pale, staring at the camera feeds, which were now working again. On one of them, the one pointing towards the hallway leading to the substation, something appeared. It wasn't human, or if it was, it didn't walk like one. It was a hunched, almost reptilian figure that vanished as it turned a corner. The rest of the night was chaos. No more blackouts, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong never left us. No one spoke about what we saw, not the next day, not in the reports we filed. Management attributed the failures to technical errors. But deep down, I know something else happened that night. Since then, I haven't walked alone through the plant again, and every time I hear a noise in the tunnels, I wonder if what we saw is still there, feeding on the energy we swore to protect.
My name is Esteban, and I work as a night watchman at the Chapultepec Zoo. I took the job a few months ago because it offered flexible hours and a decent salary, enough to support myself while I sort out my situation with the university. To be honest, I never thought guarding a zoo at night would be so lonely. Without visitors, the animals seem almost unreal. Motionless figures among dense shadows and the smell of damp vegetation. The first month passed without incident, aside from the occasional stray cat sneaking into the flamingo area and forcing me to chase it away. Small felines aren't welcome here. They have a bad habit of looking for easy prey. But everything changed a week ago, on a particularly silent night. It was almost 3 a.m., and the zoo was submerged in an unsettling calm. Sitting in the security booth, I was checking the camera feeds while sipping some watery coffee to stay awake.
Suddenly, something appeared on the monitor that points toward the old cages area, the ones that stopped being used years ago after the government finally decided to modernize the facilities. At first, it was just a flash, a fleeting movement at the edge of the screen. I frowned, thinking it might be an insect or a branch swaying in the wind. But then I heard it, a dull thud, as if something metallic had fallen inside the cages. I grabbed my flashlight, adjusted my radio in case I needed help, and headed toward the area. As I crossed the stone path leading to the old cages, I felt the air change, the familiar zoo smell, a mix of wet grass, manure, and dry leaves, faded, replaced by a metallic scent, like blood or rust. When I arrived, I swept the area with my flashlight. The cages were empty, just as they were supposed to be. But then I noticed it. One of the doors was slightly open, something that shouldn't have been possible. Those cages had been locked with rusty padlocks for years, and no one had mentioned they would be used again. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out, in a firm tone, trying not to sound nervous. My voice echoed through the air, but there was no answer. I moved closer. The half-open door creaked as I pushed it with the tip of my foot. Inside, the cage was empty, except for a dark trail on the ground that looked like blood. I turned my flashlight to its brightest setting, trying to find where it came from, but I saw nothing else. As I stepped back, I heard something behind me, a soft scrape against metal. I turned so fast I almost dropped the flashlight, but there was no one there, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the echo of my footsteps on the stone floor. Trying to calm myself, I slammed the cage door shut and returned to the booth. I decided to log it as a possible loose animal, even though I knew no animal was supposed to be in those cages. The following nights were no better. Every time I patrolled the area, I heard noises, footsteps, deep breathing, or something dragging itself along. Even in the booth, far from the cages, I felt as if something was watching me through the monitors. One early morning, I finally worked up the courage to review the camera footage more closely. In one of the recordings, I saw something chilling, a crouched silhouette inside one of the empty cages, with eyes glowing in the darkness. But when I went to check in person, there was nothing there. I couldn't take the mystery anymore, so I told the supervisor what had been happening. I thought he would think I was crazy, but his response froze me in place. "Ah, the old cages. Some say those noises started when they brought in some exotic animals years ago. They were illegal. Animals that were never officially registered. They died or were taken out secretly. But who knows? Sometimes I wonder if they all really left. Since then, I avoid patrolling that area alone. But even when I'm far away, I still feel its presence, as if whatever was there never truly left."
The job of a trailer truck driver has always been my life. There's something about being on the road, with the engine roaring and the landscape changing, that fills me with a strange sense of calm. But that night, while I was fueling up diesel at a gas station outside Zacatecas, I didn't know I was about to embark on the most terrifying journey of my life. I had already finished my shift when the phone rang. It was my boss, Don Roberto, asking me for a favor, an urgent delivery that had to reach the north before sunrise. The pay was good, and although I was tired, I accepted. Within minutes, I was back in my trailer with a sealed crate on the back platform and a document stating that under no circumstances was I to open it. It was a dark, moonless night, and the roads were deserted. As soon as I left the city limits, the highway began to feel lonelier. The trailer's headlights illuminated curves in a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly. Everything was calm until I heard a sound, a thud, as if something inside the crate had fallen. Must be the cargo shifting, I told myself, trying to stay calm, but an inexplicable unease began to grow in my chest. Shortly after, another noise, a thud, this time louder, as if something had struck the trailer's inner walls. I slowed down and pulled over, flashlight in hand. I walked to the platform. The seals were intact, and the trailer looked fine. I took a deep breath and returned to the driver's seat, trying to shake off the discomfort. A few kilometers down the road, the thuds began again, more insistent and rhythmic, as if something inside the crate was trying to get out. My mind started playing tricks on me. What the hell am I carrying back there? I thought. I thought about opening it, but the document explicitly forbade it, and breaking the seals could cost me my job. I passed through a small, silent town. No lights in the houses, not a single car on the road. The thuds continued. Then I felt a vibration under my feet, as if something had started moving inside the trailer. My imagination ran wild. An animal? Something alive? My paranoia grew, but I kept driving, trying to focus on the road. When I reached an especially dark stretch, I saw something in the rearview mirror that froze my blood. A silhouette moving inside the crate, as if someone or something was banging from the inside. I slammed on the brakes, turned off the engine, and got out of the trailer, flashlight ready. The road was completely empty, and the cold night air made my nerves raw. I slowly approached the back of the trailer and placed my hand on the metal. I felt a slight movement, as if something was shifting inside. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer, but the thud started immediately, somehow even more terrifying. Back at the wheel, I noticed my GPS had shut off. I tried restarting it, but the screen was completely blank. I looked at my phone, no signal. Driving aimlessly on these lonely roads was the last thing I wanted, but I had no choice. As I drove on, the thuds started again, this time accompanied by a strange sound, a low, constant growl. I felt like a mouse trapped in a maze. The road seemed endless, each curve identical to the last. I looked at the clock, 3:33 a.m. There was something unsettling about that hour, as if time had stopped. I decided to seek help at the next town, but when I saw the lights of a gas station in the distance, something inside the trailer slammed so hard that the entire vehicle vibrated. A human or animal scream rang out clearly. I stopped in front of the station, hoping to find someone, but it was completely deserted. I stepped out of the trailer, flashlight sweeping in all directions. The air was charged with unbearable tension. Suddenly, a noise behind me made me spin around. The crate shifted slightly, as if something was pushing from inside. Then I saw it, a dark figure, almost indistinguishable from the night shadows, retreating toward the brush along the road. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know if I was hallucinating from exhaustion or if something was really stalking me. I got back in the trailer and sped off, ignoring the speed limits. The thuds continued, more insistent than ever, as if whatever was inside the crate knew I was nearing my limit. Just a few more hours, I kept telling myself, trying to calm down. When I finally reached the delivery point, a remote warehouse in the middle of nowhere, a burly man in a reflective vest met me as soon as I stopped the trailer. I explained what had happened. His face showed no surprise. He just nodded and pointed toward the office. "Wait there," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. From the office window, I watched them open the crate. I couldn't see what was inside, but the burly man and his colleagues moved with a mix of urgency and caution. Something heavy covered with tarps was loaded onto another vehicle. When they returned the signed document, I asked the man what I had transported. He looked at me with an unreadable expression and said, "It's better that you don't know." I took the paper, started the engine, and drove away, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety I couldn't shake. Since then, I've refused any sealed loads. Some questions are better left unanswered.
I work as a resident doctor in a general hospital south of Guadalajara. It's an old place, built in the 1960s, with endless hallways and lighting that always seems on the verge of failing. The night shift I usually cover has a different atmosphere. It's as if the hospital itself changes personality when night falls, becoming quieter and heavier. That night began like any other. I received a patient in the emergency room, a man in his 40s, found unconscious on the street by passers-by. He had no identification, only an old backpack containing a few dirty clothes and a notebook full of illegible scribbles. We called him Patient X until we could learn more about him. When I examined him, his condition was serious but stable. He had superficial wounds on his hands and arms, as if he had been crawling, and a hematoma on his head indicating a recent blow. There were no signs of intoxication, and his blood pressure was curiously normal for someone who seemed to have endured days of neglect. I turned to the computer to create his medical record. Male, approximately 40 years old, found unconscious, no identification. Once finished, I saved the file and left it in the hands of the nursing team to stabilize him. A couple of hours later, while reviewing the orders for another patient, I felt that something didn't fit. I checked Patient X's file in the system, more out of habit than curiosity. Something had changed. Under the observations field, where I hadn't written anything, there was now a line, "Patient murmurs incomplete names while asleep." I didn't remember writing it, and no staff member had mentioned it. I thought maybe one of the nurses had added the note, although it was strange that no one had told me. I decided to verify personally. The man was in the same bed, motionless, breathing regularly, and he hadn't murmured anything. I asked the nurse in charge, an older man named Ernesto, if he had added anything to the record. He shook his head. The night went on, and other cases distracted me. A heart attack in the emergency room, a child with uncontrollable fever. But something about patient X kept bothering me. I decided to check his file again. Around 3 a.m., when the hospital was at its quietest, the file showed something completely new, a section added under medical history, traumatic cranial injury, previous undocumented surgeries. I froze. The notes looked official, but no one on my team had reported any surgeries. The man had no visible scars suggesting an operation. It had to be a system error, but the hospital used an ancient program, so errors were usually basic, file loading issues, connection failures. This wasn't that. I decided to look for physical signs of surgery. I lifted his shirt and checked his abdomen and back. Nothing, not even a line suggesting a past operation. However, when I touched his head, I found something under the hair at the base of the skull, a small protrusion like a perfectly healed scar. I tried to convince myself it was just an irregularity in his skin, but something didn't add up. I returned to his file. This time, there was another new entry under family history, history of schizophrenia on the paternal line. My confusion grew. It was impossible for that information to be there. We had no way of accessing his family history, especially without knowing who he was. I went to look for Ernesto, but when I arrived at the nursing station, he was gone. I asked the others, but no one had seen him leave. Back at patient X's room, I froze. The man was awake, sitting on the bed, staring at me with an intensity that made me feel guilty. "Doctor," he said in a rough voice. His tone was more of a statement than a question. "How are you feeling?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "It's not your fault. You just follow the rules, but they don't know." "What do you mean?" I insisted, but the man closed his eyes and collapsed back into the bed as if nothing had happened. I returned to the workstation and checked the system again. Now the file contained a new entry under clinical progress. Patient shows disturbing episodes of lucidity, potential risk to staff. That was the last straw. I closed the system and went straight to the IT officer, a young man working in a room full of cables and screens. I explained what was happening. He checked the logs, but found nothing unusual. According to his analysis, the updates appeared to have been made from my account. I didn't know what to say. I resumed my rounds, and by the time dawn arrived, Ernesto reappeared as if nothing had happened. I asked where he had been, but he just shrugged, saying I must have been mistaken. Patient X was transferred that morning to psychiatry for observation. However, his medical record remained etched in my mind. A few days later, I reviewed his file one last time. It had been updated with a diagnosis, unspecified psychotic delirium. But in the last line, in letters that were not part of the usual format, it read, "It is no longer he who is in danger."
I work at a small OXX in Monterey, one of those that never closes and always has a steady flow of customers. Most of them are familiar faces. The student who comes in for coffee and cigarettes at midnight, the taxi driver who stops by for an energy drink in the early hours of the morning, and the office workers who, before heading to work, look for a quick lunch. It was a simple job, without any major surprises, until he started coming in. He was an older man, thin, with gray hair and a slow way of walking, as if every step were carefully calculated. He always wore an impeccably ironed checkered shirt and dark pants. His presence wasn't particularly striking, but there was something about the way he looked at the products that unsettled me. I didn't notice it at first, but little by little his routine began to stand out in my memory. He came every 2 or 3 days, almost always at the same time, around 9:15 at night. He entered in silence, went straight to the dairy shelves or the refrigerator area, and then came to the register with 2 or 3 items. He never made eye contact and said nothing more than what was necessary. "Would you like a bag?" I would ask. He would reply in a deep but calm voice. He paid the exact amount and left, leaving behind a faint smell of tobacco and cheap cologne. The strange part began a few weeks after I first noticed him. One night, while I was organizing products in the refrigerator, something caught my attention. One of the yogurts he had bought the previous week had an expiration date that matched the day of a fatal accident I had seen on the local news. It was a tragedy involving a multiple car crash on Morones Avenue, where several people died, including an 8-year-old child. I didn't think much of it. It was just a coincidence. But the next day, when he returned and bought another product, a bottle of milk, I found myself staring at the expiration date as I scanned it. October 18th. I shuddered as I remembered that this was the day a fire had consumed a house in the Independence neighborhood, killing a mother and her young daughter. The coincidences kept piling up. Although at first I tried to ignore them, every item the man bought seemed to have an expiration date that matched some tragic event appearing in the news. I began obsessively checking the dates, writing them down along with details of the accidents. It wasn't possible. Logic told me that expiration dates were randomly generated by companies. There was no way an ordinary customer could predict something as specific as a fatal accident. Still, every time that man bought something, I felt a tightness in my chest. It was as if he knew something I didn't. One particularly quiet night, I decided to ask him a few questions while scanning his items. He had chosen a package of cheese and a bottle of juice. "You always come at this time," I said, pretending casual curiosity. He looked up, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They were dull gray, like those of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Night is a good time to shop. There's less noise," he replied. His voice was measured, almost mechanical. I said nothing more, but I felt that he knew I had been watching him more than usual. When he left the store, I stared at his receipt and, as had become my habit, checked the dates. The cheese expired on October 27th and the juice on November 2nd. A strange anxiety washed over me. Those dates were close, but nothing had happened yet to link them to anything. October 27th arrived quickly, and with it a tragedy. That night, while watching the news on the small television in the store, I heard of an accident on the Monterey Metro. A train car had derailed, leaving several injured and 2 dead. I couldn't help but look at the date in the corner of the screen, October 27th. I closed my eyes, feeling an inexplicable vertigo. November 2nd, Day of the Dead, was even worse. An entire family died in a fire started in their own home, apparently due to a short circuit. When I saw the news on my phone, I almost dropped it. It could no longer be a coincidence. I became obsessed.
Every night I checked the store, looking for signs that something else might be happening. I started analyzing other customers, searching for patterns, but none of them had the disturbing connection to tragedies that this man did. One night, I decided to confront him. He walked in at 9:15, as always, and this time bought a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk. "Excuse me," I said, while scanning the items. "You always come at this time." I pretended casual curiosity. He looked up, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They were dull gray, like those of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Night is a good time to shop. There's less noise," he replied. His voice was measured, almost mechanical. I said nothing more, but I felt that he knew I had been watching him more than usual. When he left the store, I stared at his receipt and, as had become my habit, checked the dates. The cheese expired on October 27th and the juice on November 2nd. A strange anxiety washed over me. Those dates were close, but nothing had happened yet to link them to anything. October 27th arrived quickly, and with it a tragedy. That night, while watching the news on the small television in the store, I heard of an accident on the Monterey Metro. A train car had derailed, leaving several injured and 2 dead. I couldn't help but look at the date in the corner of the screen, October 27th. I closed my eyes, feeling an inexplicable vertigo. November 2nd, Day of the Dead, was even worse. An entire family died in a fire started in their own home, apparently due to a short circuit. When I saw the news on my phone, I almost dropped it. It could no longer be a coincidence. I became obsessed. Every night I checked the store, looking for signs that something else might be happening. I started analyzing other customers, searching for patterns, but none of them had the disturbing connection to tragedies that this man did. One night I decided to confront him. He walked in at 9:15, as always, and this time bought a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk. "Excuse me," I said, while scanning the items. "You always come at this time." I pretended casual curiosity. He looked up, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They were dull gray, like those of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Night is a good time to shop. There's less noise," he replied. His voice was measured, almost mechanical. I said nothing more, but I felt that he knew I had been watching him more than usual.
I work as a night watchman at a bus depot in the south of Mexico City. It's not the most exciting job, but it has its advantages: solitude, silence, and the feeling of being in charge of something, even if it's just immobile vehicles. Every night I walk the aisles of the enormous lot, lit only by yellowish lamps that cast long shadows over the bus bodies. The depot houses buses of different routes and sizes, from giant long-distance coaches to the smaller microbuses that run through the neighborhoods. Each one has an assigned spot, numbered in a log that I have to check at the beginning of my shift to make sure everything is in order. My routine used to be simple: an initial round to verify that everything was fine, a couple more rounds during the night, and many hours sitting in the guard booth with my thermos of coffee. But a couple of weeks ago, something broke that monotony. That night, I arrived, as always, right at
10. I took over from my coworker Manuel, who looked more serious than usual. "Everything okay?" I asked him. "Yeah, I think so. Just be careful, Jorge. Something doesn't sit right with me in the lot." I didn't want to press him. Manuel was the kind of guy who let his nerves get the best of him. Still, his words stayed with me as I made my first round. At first, everything seemed normal. The bosses were in their assigned places, covered in dust, some of them with that characteristic diesel smell that never completely goes away. But as I walked down the last aisle of the depot, something caught my attention. There was a bus with its engine on. It was an old model, bigger than the others, with a design that reminded me of buses from decades ago. Its headlights were on, illuminating part of the aisle. I approached cautiously, thinking maybe a driver had left it there by mistake. When I checked the log, I noticed something strange. That bus wasn't on the list. 173, I read out loud. That was the number painted in white over the windshield. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I knocked on the glass and waited. No one answered. I looked through the windshield, but the interior was empty. Only the dashboard lit up, and the soft purr of the engine broke the silence of the night. I decided to report it. I called the night supervisor, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I went back to the booth and wrote the incident down in the logbook. I told myself I'd investigate more on the next round, though I couldn't help feeling a slight chill as I closed the booth gate. When I passed by the spot again 2 hours later, the bus was still running, but something was different. It seemed to have moved slightly forward, as if someone had pushed it a few meters. "That can't be," I muttered. I checked the security cameras, though they barely covered the main entrances. The monitors showed no strange movement, and the bus was still there, shining in the darkness like a strange, unsettling beacon. I grabbed my flashlight and went back down the aisle. The sound of the engine felt stronger this time, almost like a growl resonating heavily in the air. I knocked on the door glass again, but there was no response. "Is anyone here?" I shouted. The echo of my voice was lost among the dark bodies of the other buses. Only the engine answered. I tried once more to open the door, but this time, when I touched the handle, I felt an intense heat that made me pull my hand back immediately. It was as if the handle had been sitting under the sun for hours, even though it was 3 in the morning and the air was cold. The next morning I told Manuel what had happened, but his response only confused me more. "That bus showed up a few days ago. Nobody knows how it got there. I reported it, but they said there were no records of it." I tried to find information on my own. I talked to some drivers and checked the oldest records in the depot, but I found nothing about number 173. Over the following nights, the bus stayed on, as if it never shut off, always in the same place, always emitting that constant deep sound. One early morning, I decided to take my investigation a step further. Armed with a crowbar I found in the depot workshop, I forced the bus door open. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding so fast I thought I might faint.
The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had entered it in years, yet the dashboard lights shone brightly, and the engine kept roaring beneath my feet. On the seats there was something that made me step back. Old clothes, backpacks, and personal items scattered everywhere, as if the passengers had fled in a hurry without taking anything with them. Even a child's lunchbox half open with a rotten apple inside. I moved toward the dashboard to shut off the engine, but I couldn't find any button or key. It was as if the bus were running purely on inertia, powered by something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut behind me. I tried to open them, but they wouldn't budge. A feeling of claustrophobia took hold of me as the engine began to roar louder, as if the bus were coming alive. The dashboard lit up with a phrase written in bright red: "Incomplete route." I don't know how I managed to get out. I remember pounding desperately on the doors until they finally opened and I fell to my knees on the asphalt. The bus was still running, motionless, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I quit my job. I haven't been back to the depot since, but I heard that the bus disappeared a couple of days later, just as mysteriously as it had arrived. Some nights, when I'm alone at home, I could swear I hear the sound of an engine running in the distance. I try to ignore it, but part of me knows that bus number 173 is still out there, waiting for someone. Who, I don't know, and I don't want to find out.
My name is Tomas. I work as a night caretaker in a public park in Puebla, one of those places full of worn-out benches and flickering streetlights that during the day are the heart of the city. My shift starts at 9 p.m. and ends at dawn. I like the solitude of my job, the silence broken only by crickets and the creaking of branches when the wind blows hard. But lately, that silence has been filled with something else, something I can't explain. It all began a few weeks ago. It was a cold, early morning, the kind of night when your lungs burn with every breath of air. I was making my rounds through the children's playground, a wooden and metal structure with rusted slides that had seen better days. Everything was in order, as always. When I returned to that same area at dawn, something caught my attention. There was a teddy bear lying right at the foot of the slide. It was small, a faded brown color, with one eye barely hanging by a thread. I picked it up, thinking a child had forgotten it during the day. I took it to the guard booth and left it there with other lost items. I didn't give it any more thought. But the next day, something similar happened. This time, it was a red plastic ball, one of those that bounces with a hollow sound. I found it on the most isolated swing in the park, barely swaying with the breeze. I remember frowning. Myself had passed through that area just a few hours earlier, and there had been nothing there. I decided to check the security cameras. The park has a couple of old cameras that cover the main areas, including the playground. The footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. Just me doing my rounds, no one else. Over the following weeks, I started finding more objects. A rusted tricycle I didn't remember seeing before, a toy car with worn wheels, a doll in a blue dress stained with dirt.
always in places I had already passed through. I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, some bored neighbor or a teenager trying to scare me. But who would go to so much trouble? One night, I decided to stay near the playground for almost my entire shift. I hid behind a thick tree with my flashlight turned off, waiting for whoever was responsible to show themselves. The hours passed slowly, and the only sound I heard was branches knocking against each other in the wind. At 5 in the morning, I came out of my hiding place and walked toward the swings. There it was, a jump rope, perfectly coiled right in the center of the sandbox. Things got worse on a rainy night. Patrols in the rain had always seemed comforting to me. The park was completely empty. Raindrops hit the leaves of the trees, and the air smelled of wet earth. Around 2 a.m., as I walked along a stone path, I noticed something strange in the distance. A small figure sitting on one of the benches near the artificial lake. It was a little girl. She was wearing a white dress, completely soaked. Her dark hair hung in heavy strands over her face. I approached her, confused and a little alarmed. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying not to sound too harsh. She didn't respond. I asked where her parents were, but she remained motionless, staring at the lake. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I stepped closer and reached out to touch her shoulder, but at that very moment she jumped up and ran toward the water. I followed her, shouting for her to stop, but when I reached the edge of the lake, there was no one there. There weren't even any footprints in the mud. That dawn, I found a small rolling suitcase abandoned by the lake. It was old, almost falling apart, and inside there was only a notebook with children's drawings, all of them of a figure that looked like a girl standing under a tree. The situation became unbearable. Every night I found something new, a music box with an out-of-tune melody, a balloon that looked freshly inflated, a rattle that kept vibrating as if someone had just shaken it. But I never saw anyone. I told my daytime shift co-workers, hoping someone would have an explanation. One of them, Raoul, listened in silence and then looked at me seriously. "That park has its history, you know. Years ago, before they installed the cameras and all that, they said a girl disappeared here. They never found her body, but people swear she still wanders here looking for something." I laughed, though the sound came out forced. "So you're telling me I'm seeing ghosts?" I joked. Raoul just shrugged. "My last night in the park was 3 days ago. I couldn't take it anymore. I spent the entire shift trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, compulsively checking every corner, making sure there was nothing strange. When dawn came, I headed to the playground for my final round. When I arrived, my heart stopped. The swings, the slide, the sandbox, everything was filled with toys. There were stuffed animals, dolls, plastic trucks, colorful balls. It was as if someone had emptied an entire toy store there. And in the center of the sandbox there was a small wooden sign, written in childish handwriting. "Thank you for taking care of them. Now they can rest." I quit that very day. I never set foot in that park again. But sometimes, on silent nights, I still hear the out-of-tune melody of that music box, like a distant echo that follows me.
I've worked as a freelance programmer for years. It's a solitary trade, but I like it. My world is lines of code, quiet nights, and the soft hum of my laptop's fan. My workspace is my small apartment in Guadalajara on the 4th floor of an old building. My hours aren't normal. I work when silence takes over the city, from 10 at night until the sun starts to ask questions. Recently, I took on a large project for a tech startup. They wanted a complex platform, something between a social network and a data analysis tool. The scale of the challenge excited me, but I also knew it would require many sleepless nights. The team was remote. We were spread across Mexico, Spain, and the United States. We used a chat to coordinate, a simple system integrated into the project software. The client also had access, although they rarely intervened. The first few weeks were normal. Routine messages, task assignments, debates over features. Everything was going well, until one night. Shortly after 2 a.m., a message appeared in the chat. User X. Who left that file in the hidden folder? I didn't recognize that username. I thought it might be a curious client, maybe someone new on the team, although no one had mentioned a new member. I replied, Me. What file are you referring to? There are no hidden folders in the repository. There was silence for a couple of minutes. Then came the reply. You shouldn't deny what you don't understand. The response irritated me a bit, but I assumed it was a joke from some sleep-deprived teammate. I dropped the subject and kept working. Still, something bothered me. I checked the list of users connected to the chat. There was no one else active at that moment. The next day, I mentioned the incident in the team's virtual meeting. I thought someone would laugh and confess to the little prank, but everyone stayed silent. Our project leader, Marta, a serious and methodical Spaniard, interrupted. User X? We don't have any user with that name in the system. The chat was directly linked to the project's version control. It wasn't possible to enter without being registered in the user database. Marta said she would review the server logs to make sure there hadn't been a security breach. That night, while I was reviewing some authentication functions, the chat activated again. You're always here, aren't you? A chill ran down my spine. My first impulse was to close the chat, but instead I replied, Me. Who are you? The response came immediately. I'm the one who watches what you build. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the server activity logs in real time. There was nothing indicating that any external user was connected. I went back to the chat. Me, why are you here? Because this isn't just your project, it's mine too. I stood up from my desk, unable to keep typing. The air in my apartment felt heavy, charged with something intangible. I shut down the computer and decided I'd worked enough for one night. The next day, Marta sent me a private message. There was no record of any user X. According to the logs, the chat hadn't received messages from anyone other than me during that time.
I thought about telling her what had happened, but something stopped me. Maybe it was embarrassment or the feeling that no one would believe me. That night, I went back to work. I had decided to ignore any strange messages. However, when I opened the project's main file, I noticed something out of place. There was a new function I didn't remember writing. It was labeled with a comment in all caps, "To those who watch." I opened the function and discovered it did nothing useful. It was just an infinite loop that printed the phrase, "You are here," on the screen. My hands felt like they were burning. Someone was messing with me. How had that code gotten there? I deleted it, convinced it was a cruel joke by one of my teammates. At midnight, the chat activated again. "Why did you delete it?" My mouth went dry. This time I didn't answer. I closed the chat and went back to the file. The function was back, exactly the same, as if I had never deleted it. I tried to trace the origin of the code, but there was no information in the metadata. It was as if it had appeared by magic. Days passed, and user X's messages became more personal. He seemed to know things about me, things that weren't in any public profile. One night he wrote, "You like working with the lights off. It seems you don't care who might be behind you." I turned around immediately. My desk is against the wall, and behind me there's a small living room with a sofa and a closed window. Nothing was out of place, but I closed the curtains and turned on all the lights in the apartment. The following week, Marta announced that the project's servers had been migrated to a new platform for security reasons. According to her, they had found traces of anomalous activity, although she didn't give details. That reassured me a little, but the messages continued. The strangest thing was that no one else seemed to receive them. One night, while reviewing the files, I noticed that the repository name had changed. It was now called Mirror. Inside, there was only one file, a text file titled final.txt. When I opened it, I found a simple message. "The eyes watching you are your own, but you don't recognize them. Go back or move forward and face me." My heart was racing. Without thinking twice, I deleted the entire repository and disconnected my computer from the network. The next morning, I received an email from Marta. She said the project had been cancelled and that all the files were compromised. No one could explain how it had happened, but the client decided to shut everything down. I was paid for the work completed, but I never heard from them again. Since then, I've changed computers and platforms for work. Still, sometimes in the stillness of the night, I think I hear the faint sound of a notification. I freeze when I remember it. I never opened the project chat again, but in my mind, the name still echoes. User X.